Pennsylvania has a rich history, tracing back to America's 13 original colonies. From the Founding Fathers meeting in Philadelphia to Pittsburgh becoming a manufacturing powerhouse that fueled America's Industrial Revolution, Pennsylvania has a remarkable history. During the railroad's most influential years, Altoona was vital to the state's and the nation's development of transportation and innovation. Altoona helped oppressed people escape slavery, transported military supplies during both world wars, created sports entertainment, advanced technological innovations, and helped bolster the nation's economy. Although the Pennsylvania Railroad has been disbanded for many years, the residents of Altoona will always remember its impressive history through various museums, educational programs, and cultural traditions. The Allegheny Portage Railroad was the first railroad built over the Allegheny Mountains in 1834. This technological wonder was critical in transporting people and goods over the Allegheny Mountains in just 6 hours, making their journey from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh significantly shorter.
In Pennsylvania in the 1830s, there was no real fast way to get across the state of Pennsylvania. In New York State, they had the Erie Canal, and people were bypassing Philadelphia as a port city because it took so long to get across Pennsylvania. And the state was looking for a way to move people and goods faster. And they came up with the Pennsylvania Mainline Canal system, and it ran from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. The whole thing was almost 400 miles across the state. And canals were the preferred method of travel then, which worked well for most of Pennsylvania. The Allegheny Mountains really were a barrier to the western side of Pennsylvania. And there were a couple different solutions that the state came up with to conquer the Allegheny Mountains. Railroads were very much in their infancy at the time, and because canals were preferred, one idea was to dig a canal through the mountains. The problem was how to keep water in it. One of the estimates was that it could take up to 30 years to build. And the problem was that other parts of the mainline canal were almost ready to open, and we still haven't figured out how to get over the Allegheny Mountains. This was the final piece. And without this piece, you aren't able to travel from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. So the canal idea wasn't really going to work. So they thought about a turnpike road over the mountains. The Northern Turnpike ran close to this area already. You can only fit so many goods in a wagon. You can only fit so many people at a time. So they came up with the Allegheny Portage Railroad and used 10 inclined planes, 5 on each side of the mountains, to carry people and goods over the Allegheny Mountains. So this stretch of railroad connected 2 canal basins, one in Hollidaysburg and one in Johnstown, and really was an engineering marvel of its day for how they built this system and made it work.
The process started in the Hollidaysburg Canal Basin, where passengers and goods were floated by boat and pulled by railroad cars in the Allegheny Portage Railroad.
Because locomotives didn't have enough power at the time, at the top of each of the 10 inclined planes was an engine house building, and inside of the engine house was a stationary steam engine, 35 horsepower, that pulled everything up the inclined planes. And then on the level sections, it was horses for the first year. And then starting in 1835, it was the slow incorporation of steam locomotives. So it wasn't everywhere, it wasn't all at once. In 1835, you get a couple locomotives that run back and forth on one level section, and then you get a few more and a few more. So a lot of changes happened very soon after 1834 with the double track and starting to use locomotives on the level sections.
Once they reached the top of the mountain, passengers were able to take a short break at the Lemon House, which was a tavern owned by Samuel Lemon and his family. The Lemon family provided meals, drinks, and a place to relax for the passengers who were making their journey over the Allegheny Mountains.
So the Lemon House, for the most part, was a quick in and out stop for people. It was about a 15 to 20-minute stop, a chance to stretch out, grab a bite to eat. There was no menu to order from in the Lemon House because you didn't have a lot of time. So if you're a weary, hungry traveler, you can go in. Mrs. Lemon and her staff already have the food prepared. You can sit down, quickly be served, eat, and be on your way. The level sections, it was about 18 miles an hour. And Ulysses S. Grant remarked that traveling on the level sections was so fast, it was like annihilating space. So while today it seems very slow to us, these people are riding on a unique system like nothing they've ever been on before. And to go along with that, a few summers ago, I was talking to a family that came here to visit the park, and they had a journal from one of their ancestors that rode on the Allegheny Portage Railroad. And they said that they were traveling so fast that they couldn't make out the individual trees. It was like they all blurred together. So I think that's interesting, seeing things how they would have seen them at that time.
The descent down the mountain consisted of the same process and ended up being a lot faster because gravity was on their side. The boats were let off the train cars at the Johnstown Canal Basin and continued their journey towards Pittsburgh.
There are all sorts of different experiences of travelers. A lot of travel accounts that were written at the time, people really enjoyed the scenery of Pennsylvania. They would describe that in great detail, the beauty of the Allegheny Mountains. But also, one thing that a lot of people didn't like was sharing close space with people that you didn't know for days on end. So taverns were seen as welcome sights for travelers, such as the Lemon House. It's a chance to catch up on the news of the day. So if we're traveling together for a few days, we sort of know what everybody else knows. So it's a nice chance to catch up on the news of the day, meet up with fellow travelers. Most people had never ridden on a system like this. So it was nice to share travel stories, to see what you may encounter next on your travels. If you're traveling towards Hollidaysburg, you went through Staple Bend Tunnel, which was the first railroad tunnel in America. When they were building it, they described a tunnel as a horizontal well because people didn't really know what tunnels were. There were a few in existence for canal purposes, but this was the first railroad tunnel. So sort of sharing stories like that. I've never been through a tunnel before. It's 901 feet of total darkness. So, I'm going to ask you, what was it like to go through the Staple Bend Tunnel? So sort of sharing those unique experiences.
There were also many notable figures that traveled on the Allegheny Portage Railroad.
Several famous passengers that traveled on the Allegheny Portage Railroad. Perhaps the most famous is Charles Dickens. He traveled on the Allegheny Portage Railroad during his first trip to America. And he ended up writing a book about his travels. It was called American Notes for General Circulation, and he detailed not only his trip on the Mainline Canal and the Allegheny Portage Railroad, but also all of his travels through America at the time, everywhere he went. Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale, was on tour with P.T. Barnum, and she traveled on the Allegheny Portage Railroad. Ulysses S. Grant traveled on the Allegheny Portage Railroad on his way to West Point.
The Allegheny Portage Railroad also played a part in the Underground Railroad and helped fugitive slaves escape. One of the most notable was Jacob Green.
So Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site actually has a designation on the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. So Jacob Green was an enslaved person in Romney, Virginia, which is today part of West Virginia. And he left several times, came back, helped others escape as well. And information gathered that Jacob Green was more than likely heading north and was going to travel across Pennsylvania. So Jacob Green actually boarded a train car in Hollidaysburg, and one of the men that was sent in pursuit of him was actually on that same train car. And there were abolitionists in Hollidaysburg who basically said, Pennsylvania is a free state. No one has the right to take Jacob Green back with them. And a newspaper article said that it almost caused a civil war between Pennsylvania and Virginia over what to do about Jacob Green. Thankfully, he somehow escaped amidst everything that happened that day, and it's believed that he made it north to freedom. So the Allegheny Portage Railroad was used as a means for escape.
The railroad also helped with the growth of the area and also had a major effect on the economy by moving goods and people throughout the region.
People were really excited about the Mainline Canal they knew that living along this route was going to be life-changing. A lot of the small towns in Pennsylvania really grew in population because this system came through. Lots of jobs, blacksmiths, different shops in these towns. So they became really busy places. People can now travel faster as well as goods. And people in this area now for the first time have access to things that would have taken a really long time to get here. So they would have been very expensive. So now the price is lower. You can get these goods faster. And it was a benefit to the state because it's bringing travelers through now that there is this faster way.
The Allegheny Portage Railroad was the first of its kind and was the beginning steps that led into the larger development of railways during that time.
So because railroads were in their infancy in the early 1830s when this system was being built, the state sent engineers to England to study how they built railroads since theirs had been around longer. And so they brought some ideas back with them that were incorporated here, such as the stone sleepers, which were the foundations for the rails on the level sections. But very quickly after this system opened, you had rapid advances in technology. I often think about the people living here at that time and how things probably changed so fast it was hard to keep up with them. Prior to the Allegheny Portage Railroad opening, it took about 3 weeks to get across the state. So say 1833, the main line canal wasn't complete, it takes about 3 weeks. Spring of 1834, it now takes about 5 to 7 days with the main line canal to get across the state of Pennsylvania. And then with the Pennsylvania Railroad's all-track line across the state in the 1850s, they're able to do it in 1 day. So in about a 20-year time period, you go from 3 weeks to travel across the state to 1 day. What an incredible time difference in such a short period of time.
With the Pennsylvania Railroad completed in 1846, the use of the Allegheny Portage Railroad became less traveled and eventually ceased operations in 1854.
Once the Pennsylvania Railroad had their all-track line across the state, quickly was the end of the Allegheny Portage Railroad, just because now there's a faster way to get from point A to point B. And for most people, if you had the option to get across the state in 5 days or 1 day, most people were gonna pick the 1 day option. So while this was a huge reduction in time when the Allegheny Portage Railroad opened, with steam locomotives having more power, you don't need the incline planes or stationary engines because they now have enough power to go up over the mountains unaided. That soon spelled the end for the Allegheny Portage Railroad. So even though it wasn't around for a really long period of time, about 20 years, it was an engineering marvel of its day for what the state did at that time, for how they built the system and how they made it operate.
With the start of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Altoona's population grew significantly, and the city became a staple of the Northeast and for industrialization during the 19th century.
The beginning of Altoona is simultaneous with the presence of the Pennsylvania Railroad in this area of central Pennsylvania. Without the Pennsylvania Railroad, there is no Altoona as we know it today. It all started on the farmstead of a local individual whose name was David Robeson. And he was offered something along the lines of $10,000 for his plot of property in the late 1840s because some engineers and businessmen from the PRR came and knocked on his door and they said, "We want to buy your property for this handsome sum." And he quickly took them up on the offer. And that was the beginning of Altoona.
The famous Horseshoe Curve was a key component for the transportation of people and goods. The 3-track line trafficked as much as 250 trains per day during the height of World War II.
At the heart of this system that goes through central Pennsylvania is the Horseshoe Curve. This was an engineering landmark, a colossal engineering wonder of its time. It took about 3 years to construct between 1851 and 1854. Approximately 300 to 400 largely Irish immigrants were the individuals who were responsible for constructing it. And they did it with picks, axes, shovels, and black powder. And with those primitive tools by our standards today, they were able to carve out this ledge from this imposing mountain feature. And they were able to create a transit link that hugged the side of the mountain rather than just barreling right through it. And so it was a work of immense talent, incredible work, and it still remains a major transportation artery to this very day.
By the 1860s, the railroad was an important company that played a huge part in the Civil War and helped the Union defeat the Confederate States.
In the year 1862, as the American Civil War was underway, that was when the Pennsylvania Railroad actually started to build locomotives here within Railroad City, as it would become known. And so the Civil War, like it was for so many other industrial towns, it was a truly transformative moment for the community. And it set the stage, industrially speaking, for everything that would follow. This is one of many reasons why we often refer to the Civil War as the first modern war. When you think about the level of efficiency, commitment, and new standards of technology, new relationships in regard to industry and labor, it's truly a point of no return, and Altoona was a major part of that.
During this time, the Pennsylvania Railroad and Altoona played a major role in facilitating the operations of the Underground Railroad. As one of the largest and most extensive railroad systems in the country at the time, the Pennsylvania Railroad's infrastructure and network provided crucial transportation links for freedom seekers. Its routes, particularly those running through Pennsylvania, were utilized by abolitionists and conductors of the Underground Railroad to help move escaped slaves toward freedom.
This area had a very active role in anti-slavery and Underground Railroad activities in the years leading up to the American Civil War. Geography has a huge part to do with all of this. When you consider the Allegheny Mountains and how Pennsylvania connects with Maryland, a slave state, this becomes a very natural thoroughfare for freedom-seeking individuals who want to work their way toward Lake Erie, New England, or Canada. Within the city of Altoona itself, we have traces of evidence to suggest that the areas of what are now 8th, 9th, and 10th Avenues were very much the central district for a lot of these Underground Railroad activities. These were avenues that were right near the tracks. If an escapee had jumped a train, if they had posed as somebody else, if they were in flight, those neighborhoods were in close proximity to the tracks that would allow them to mingle amongst the city and perhaps also find safe refuge.
One of the most famous hotels, the Logan House, was where the War Governors Conference of 1862 took place. The state leaders convened at the Logan House to come up with a plan to defeat the Confederate States and stand by President Lincoln in the Emancipation Proclamation.
One of the most notable, if not the most notable, event to happen at the Logan House, if not the most notable event in the history of Altoona itself, was the Loyal War Governors Conference of 1862. This was an event in which a dozen northern governors convened at the height of the American Civil War, and the two-day conference that they held pledged support to President Abraham Lincoln. They pledged to raise an additional 100,000 U.S. troops to suppress the rebellion, and most notably, it becomes one of the first public acts of support on behalf of the recently released Emancipation Proclamation, which redefines why the American Civil War is being fought. So some very momentous things were happening here in Altoona's railroad hotels.
The Logan House was also a hotel for people who were passing through and was a prestigious one for its time.
The Logan House was truly one of the first grand features to be found in Altoona. It was constructed in the mid 1850s. It's coinciding with the ascendance of the city, and it's by and large used as a railroad traveler's rest. This was in the days before sleeper cars. People could not necessarily find very comfortable lodgings on trains, and therefore, every few dozen miles, you would have railroad hotels. This was an incredibly luxurious, up to date, modern facility that hosted the likes of royalty, presidents, first families, celebrities, people who were really the elite of American society in the 19th and early 20th centuries.
The Pennsylvania Railroad furthered the growth of the city of Altoona, with many relocating to find work and settle down. The population grew and became an important hub for work and family life in Pennsylvania.
Reverend James Duckrey. Now, hopefully, you understood when I used the word PRR. I'm talking about Pennsylvania Railroad Company town. Well, Altoona was a company town, and that was the main employer. So, Reverend James Duckrey worked in the Philadelphia headquarters of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and as the growth of the um, northern industries continued, there was a need for people to work. Um, this especially, of course, um, uh, accelerated when World War One came, and then World War Two, because white men were going off to fight, so you need bodies to replace them. So they felt the vice president of the time of the PRR believed that this gentleman could reach those who were sharecroppers. So in the South, after the Civil War, you have, of course, Reconstruction, but that ends in 1877 when the federal troops move out of the South, and then the state governments took over, which were all white, and then you have laws like the Jim Crow laws instituted in the South. Most African Americans in the South did not move too far away from where they were enslaved, and they typically were set up to work for, probably more than likely, the former plantation owner. And it was a system where they were basically cheated out of ever earning any money. So sharecropping, this is the land. I give you a loan to work it. You work it, tobacco, cotton, other grains. And then when you try to sell it, I tell you, if I'm the owner, you didn't make enough money to pay off the loan. Um, so it's just another form of servitude. So when Reverend James Darkreek goes down the South, he can tell folks there is an option, there's another alternative, there's a way to get out of your situation that you are in, and you'll get paid more. Working in the North for northern industries like the Pennsylvania Railroad means that the family could have access to schools beyond the fourth or fifth or sixth grade. I'm from the South. I know of the stories of my grandmother and her sisters. You could go to school to the sixth grade, but beyond that, you need transportation. The schools were typically, black schools were typically in the more of the urban area. Back to economic opportunities, schools, being able to earn more than what they were being paid, an opportunity to perhaps do other things like open a business, restaurant, for example. These people are willing to hear the story and say, yes, I want to take advantage of that. So yeah, he does his job, goes down there, talks about you can make more money, you can help your family, your children can get educated, and make a better life. So the American dream is offered to these group of people who it had been denied to.
In the 1930s and the 1940s, there were approximately 80,000 people that called Altoona home. It's about half that number today. And close to a third of those 80,000 people worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad in one form or another. And so it's a far cry from what it was at the height of the Second World War.
The Pennsylvania Railroad also helped bring in forms of entertainment through sports, such as cricket and baseball. Though a cricket field was a form of entertainment, for the area it was also used to bring in English investors.
The Pennsylvania Railroad established Cricket Field, and it does so for a few reasons. One, it wants to show that this is a cultivated, sophisticated, up-and-coming industrial town. It's not merely a bunch of rubes living out in the sticks. We play gentlemen's sports here in Altoona, and it was also a means to connect with English businessmen who were coming here and thinking about investing in the Pennsylvania Railroad. And of course, cricket is the ultimate British gentleman's game, and what a better way to resonate with them than to have one of their national sports here in Railroad City. The complex grew over the years and it became more Americanized as it expanded. There was a baseball field that was incorporated. The Pennsylvania Railroad had its own baseball team. It played exhibition games against traveling teams, the likes of Babe Ruth and Satchel Paige and Shoeless Joe Jackson played here throughout the early decades of the 20th century. But even more importantly for the city of Altoona, it was an important civic and sports venue where everybody from exhibition teams to Little League and so many other things came together to demonstrate community pride and civic spirit.
The Pennsylvania Railroad brought people in entertainment and athletics. So, in addition to those coming from the north, you have Negro baseball league teams come through the area and play. So, the teams from Pittsburgh, there are two teams. One's the Homestead Graves, the other one is the Pittsburgh Crawdads. They would come and play in Altoona against the local company teams. That was also something else that occurred with the local blacks, is they had their own baseball team, amateur, and they would play they play against other amateur black baseball teams in the different towns, Hollidaysburg, Johnstown, Bedford, and other places. Basketball, another entertainment or recreation. So that was also something that occurred as more blacks came to this area.
In addition to sports, the Pennsylvania Railroad also brought entertainment to Altoona through the construction of the Juniata Park, also known today as Lakemont Park, which was a large amusement park that opened in 1894. In the entertainment industry, vaudeville, which began around 1865, was vital to Altoona. As the Pennsylvania Railroad connected Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, many vaudeville entertainers would travel by train and perform on their way. Many entertainers eventually transitioned to television, such as George Burns, Jack Benny, Milton Berle, and Groucho Marx, were part of the vaudeville production and traveled on the Pennsylvania Railroad. George Burns was forever grateful to Altoona for giving him the start of his career, and he even mentioned Altoona in the title of one of his books. Because vaudeville attracted so many people, towns began to build theaters to be able to host them in their own cities. Altoona did so as well. The Mishler Theater was built in 1906. The Mishler Theater still stands today and is used for local plays. The life of railroad workers was a difficult and time-consuming occupation throughout its history. Workers put in long hours to keep up with demand and operation.
Railroad workers were toiling during various shifts during the day. Sometimes you might work morning to afternoon. Others would work evening and through the night. And so it was in the realm of possibility that some railroaders, if they worked the late shift, they may have never seen their kids during the day. And it's because their schedules just simply didn't align. And this was the price that a lot of them paid to be putting food on the table.
Railroad workers also had to deal with labor disputes and multiple strikes, the most notable being the Railway Shopmen's Strike of 1922 and the Pennsylvania Railroad President Samuel Ray's handling of the strike at the largest railroad maintenance shop in the country.
People, forget how the rail companies in the late 19th and early 20th century were some of the largest companies in the United States. I mean, at that time, over 2 million people worked in rail. Today, it's like 200,000. And, he presided over big enterprises. Even though there were times in his life he was upset at the Pennsylvania Railroad, he felt he didn't get promotions sometimes, and he left them a few times, but they kept bringing him back, as they would say in The Godfather. And, he eventually rose to the leadership of the company, and he felt that, he was going to make a stand. Altoona was the largest shop, especially for repairing great locomotives in the United States. And he felt this was strategic power for the company. They had to hold on to that thing because at one point it was something like 71% of locomotives, I think, were down. They couldn't get them fixed and repaired and maintenance. And he really, felt, he had to take a stand and be loyal to his company. We forget what a pillar of the establishment these guys were, how much they were celebrated. Samuel Ray, just for instance, he received honorary degrees from University of Pennsylvania and Princeton University, two of our most prestigious universities. It's hard today to imagine railroad executives on the stages of Ivy League universities being honored as the most distinguished people in the country. But, Samuel Ray was really, and it wasn't just the Ivy League schools, he was really honored as this incredible man. But many people in the House of Labor felt that he had delivered, incredible damage to the labor movement. And, there was a lot of opposition to him. And the labor movement had a lot of great setbacks. This wasn't the first one. People soon had forgotten that in the 1870s, the Knights of Labor, which had a lot of white European Catholic workers in the railroads, they were organized and became a huge union. But then in 1886, when the bombs went off in Chicago, there was a huge crackdown, and the Knights of Labor went into very big decline. And after World War I, after that great wave of steel strike in 1919, the uprising of the coal workers in 21, and then the great rail strike of 22, they delivered some real devastating defeats to the labor movement after World War I. And Harding and then the Coolidge administration, they felt that this was a time to put labor back in its place. Coolidge then came in as president after Warren G. Harding, and he, of course, was famous for smashing the police strike in Boston, and so they had a lot of experience. But out of that 1922 strike, many people do feel that they had achieved this Railroad Act of 1926, which did create kind of a mediation process for settling labor unrest and strikes. Not everyone in the labor movement was happy with it, but it did create some frameworks for trying to resolve labor questions without them turning into violent confrontations.
Workers would go to local bars to relax and discuss labor union activities, and to also escape the influence of the railroad.
Oftentimes, when a worker would get off a shift, the first thing that they would do is go to a local pub, a local bar. And this was a means to blow off steam. It was a way to, I think, dull the senses a little bit before they go home and have to deal with the various challenges of domestic life after working a long shift. The other thing to take into account, though, is that I think in some cases, the bar is the only place where the company doesn't wield a lot of influence. The railroad built the libraries, it helped build the schools, it donates money to fraternal organizations and churches, it builds the hospitals, it builds the infrastructure, it owns some of the homes. This was the true essence of a company town. And to be able to go to a safe space, so to speak, where you could be among friends, where you could vent your frustrations, where you could potentially plan to organize your labor union activities. There was something undoubtedly therapeutic in regard to that. And some of these bars and establishments are still open today.
Before the war, the Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest and most powerful railroad in the country, with a network of tracks and faculties that stretched across much of the Northeast and the Midwest. The railroad was a key play in the transportation of goods and people, and played a major role in the growth and development of cities and towns throughout the region. During the war, the Pennsylvania Railroad was critical in the transportation of troops, supplies, and equipment. The railroad operated around the clock, transporting soldiers and equipment to ports of embarkment and then shipping them across the Atlantic to Europe and other theaters of war. The Pennsylvania Railroad also played a major role in development and the production of war materials, with many of its factories converted to wartime production.
When you consider the level of troops and trains passing through the area during World War II, it really staggers the imagination. This is symbolic of America being fully mobilized, fully industrialized. The factories are working 24/7. Not only is the Pennsylvania Railroad producing locomotives and boxcars and passenger cars, they're also helping to produce other pieces of wartime equipment as well, artillery barrels and various pieces of equipment to be used on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. It, it was a truly all-encompassing moment. And regardless of your age, regardless of your background, everybody was expected to participate and kick in because the circumstances were too dire.
During World War II, women played a vital role in the Pennsylvania Railroad workforce, taking on jobs that were traditionally held by men. The Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest employer in the state at the time, and its operations were essential to the war effort. Women were recruited to work in a variety of roles, including clerks, stenographers, and telegraph operators. They also worked in the railroad shops, where they helped to repair and maintain locomotives and other equipment. One of the most significant contributions made by women at the railroad was in the role of Rosie the Riveter. Women were employed in the railroad shops and riveted together to the steel components of locomotives and railcars, work that had previously been done by men. This was a critical job as the railroad was responsible for transporting troops and supplies.
By the 1940s, Altoona is the largest railroading center on planet Earth, period. There's nothing that could match the scale, the scope, the size, the money, the prestige, the number of workers. This was it. It was the heart of Pennsylvania. This was the beating heart of that industrial hub during that era. And everybody, both in the United States and America's enemies overseas, fully realized it.
Because the railroad was known as the largest industrial heart of America, during the height of the war, an attack by German saboteurs had planned to target the Horseshoe Curve in the hopes to slow the transportation of equipment being used in Europe. This would have had a large impact on the war effort.
In the spring of 1942, a Nazi plot to destroy the Horseshoe Curve and other areas of railroad industry was uncovered by the FBI. This was a multifaceted mission that was codenamed Operation Pastorius. It was initiated by the German intelligence network known as the Abwehr. And under direct supervision of Adolf Hitler himself, who devised this plan, 8 saboteurs, all of whom previously lived in the United States, all of whom spoke fluent English, were dropped off by German submarine off the coast of Long Island and Florida. They had several tens of thousands of dollars in cash. They had high explosives and other gadgetry associated with espionage. They were told to blend in, destroy whatever you can, create chaos wherever possible. And they very well may have succeeded had not 2 of the spies gotten cold feet and decided to turn in the other 6. This is how the plot is foiled by the FBI. The FBI was very quick to take credit for all of this, even though they had very little to do with its actual downfall. But in any case, this was an incident that put Altoona on high alert, created a sense of fear and paranoia. People were looking over their shoulders wondering, who among my neighbors, my workers, people in my neighborhood, could any of them be spies? Could any of them be saboteurs? It was an especially pertinent thought when considering the high number of German Americans and Italian Americans who resided here. In turn, what Operation Pastorius does is that on July 2nd, 1942, the state police, the FBI, and the city police raid Dutch Hill, the German-American neighborhood in Altoona. And they question and or apprehend some 250 residents. They take many of them to the Altoona post office, which still stands today on 11th Avenue, and they started interrogating them. They aren't able to uncover anything substantial. They aren't able to find anything incredibly incriminating. But in any case, it creates a sense of paranoia. For the duration of the war and up through 1946, the Horseshoe Curve is closed to tourists. It is put under armed guard. There is barbed wire that is wrapped around it. And that's the perfect encapsulation of how locals were not taking any chances. Simultaneous with that was the fear that the reservoirs below the Horseshoe Curve might be poisoned. Because the thought was, if somebody poisons the city reservoirs and half of the city gets sick, that means that the railroad shuts down. And if the railroad shuts down, so many aspects of wartime industry shut down with it. So there was a widespread fear and precaution that emanated from this foiled attempt to blow up the Horseshoe Curve.
After the war, the Pennsylvania Railroad continued to be an important player in the transportation industry, although it faced increasing competition from other forms of transportation, such as automobiles and airplanes. The railroad then continued to modernize and upgrade its equipment and develop new technologies and new methods of operation to remain competitive. However, like the Pennsylvania Railroad and like many other railroads in the United States, they faced significant challenges in the post-war era, including declining revenues, rising labor costs, and competition in other forms of transportation at that time.
Throughout nearly a century of production, the Pennsylvania Railroad here in Altoona built something close to 7,000 steam locomotives. And really the height, the pinnacle of their power and influence was during the years of the Second World War, when you consider the level of industrialization that was afoot at that time, compounded with the necessity for military transportation, both in regard to troop supplies and natural resources. Around 1943, 1945 is truly the ultimate moment when this city was at full mobilization. Unfortunately, shortly thereafter, we start to get a sense of the forthcoming decline of the Pennsylvania Railroad, though. because in 1945, the same year that World War II comes to an end, the Pennsylvania Railroad lost money for the first time in its nearly century of operation. And so it was in the red, first time ever. And that was a real strong indicator of some of the hardship that was forthcoming.
In the late 1940s and throughout the 1960s, the railroad merged into larger ones. In 1968, the Pennsylvania Railroad merged with its longtime rival, the New York Central Railroad, to form the Penn Central Transportation Company, which eventually filed for bankruptcy in 1970. The department that helped the railroad innovate and continuously grow was the railroad's testing department, that focused primarily on testing and evaluating various equipment, technologies, and operational practices that related to railroad operations. Their objective was to improve the efficiency, safety, and performance of the railroad system. It was established in 1874 through physical testing first, and later expanded into other departments such as chemical laboratory and locomotive testing plant.
The Pennsylvania Railroad was considered the gold standard of industrialization, and by the early 1900s, the Pennsy employed more people than the federal government did, and that is a real testament to just how much they were experimenting, the scope of their operations. But within the city of Altoona itself, the Pennsylvania Railroad realized that it needed efficiency, it needed the best technology possible, and they put everything to the utmost scientific limit. They experimented with everything. And when one walks through the Railroaders Memorial Museum, you can get a really good sense of just how expansive their testing was. Everything from the best type of oranges to the best type of brooms to the best and most durable rubber gloves that workers could be using. They put everything to the test because their reputation was dependent upon quality.
The testing departments closed in 1968 during the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central Railroad merger, and new testing was mainly outsourced to third-party engineering, research, and testing companies. The Rail Transportation Engineering program at Pennsylvania State University's Altoona College has become the main institution in the country developing the future of railways and has been doing so since 1987. It is the first and only Bachelor of Science in Rail Transportation and Engineering in the United States.
They basically developed standards for the railroad industry, not just for their own particular corporation. So they were eventually called the standard railway of the world. That's because they developed all these engineering standards, like what's the best steel to use in the rails? What's the best light bulb to use in your shops, but also in the equipment, in the rolling stock? What's the best kind of a wheel to be used on the steam? All kinds of different engineering standards, and they figured out this is the best material to use, or this is the best design, and they would spread that out to their railroad. But then other railroads would adopt similar standards, and so later throughout the late 1800s, early 1900s, other railroads began to form their own research and testing departments. But in the very same city where all of this testing was occurring, and they brought in PhDs from Yale, Charles Dudley was a PhD from Yale that was a chemist working for the PRR. In the very same city where they were doing this cutting edge engineering research and science to promote railway safety and efficiency across the country, we have started the same, we've come back full circle. We're doing the same kinds of railway engineering research to develop and improve railway safety and efficiency through our research and through our education efforts here at Penn State Altoona. So it's kind of exciting to be a part of history in that way.
The rich history of the Pennsylvania Railroad is still strong in Altoona, and with new students engineering the future, they continue to carry on the history and legacy of the Pennsylvania Railroad and look toward future innovations and advancements.
So there's a huge demand for professionals in this industry. And so the railroads basically said, yes, we need universities that are teaching railway engineering because we need to hire your students. And that's been true throughout the time that we've had this program, and will continue. I mean, we get emails probably every couple of weeks from employers saying, we need to hire your students. How can we do that? who do we talk to? And most of our graduates have multiple job offers, usually by December, even before, the December before they're going to graduate in May. And what began to happen is industry groups began to be more supported by the Class 1 railroads. So there's something called the Association of American Railroads, where all the Class 1 railroads, which are the big 6 railroads in the country, 6 to 7, now it's 6, pay into this organization. And that organization is a lobbying arm of the railroads, but they also do a lot of industry research. So they have a facility out in Pueblo, Colorado. It's a big test lab where they just run trains, around a circle, and a massive miles-long circle. They do that type of research and testing kind of together, and they're outsourcing some of that research. The AAR is outsourcing some of that to universities now. So, like Penn State Altoona, we've done research projects for the AAR that's been funded by the railroads. So, and that's our goal, to continue to kind of be a wing of that larger research effort. 20, 30 years from now, people are going to look around the railroad industry and say, wow, there's Penn State grads everywhere in this railroad industry. And we're starting to see it already. A lot of companies that contact us say, hey, our vice president of such and such is a Penn State grad. They want to talk to you. I mean, that's kind of the nature of Penn State. You see our grads everywhere in general, but I think that's going to become even more so the case within the railroad industry because of this program. There's a lot that has changed in the last even just 5 years in terms of technology with the railroad industry. Positive train control started almost a couple of decades ago. And so Congress mandated this GPS-based technology that would prevent trains from having overspeed derailments, head-to-head collisions, or going through a switch that was lined the other direction. And so this system is fully implemented now. So the trains throughout the country have a GPS system that will slow them down if they're going too fast around a curve, or prevent trains from colliding. And our students are going to be running, operating, maintaining, upgrading those systems. There's, the future potential technology for automated train operation from point to point in certain locations that could be possible. It's already happening in places like Australia. You talk about passenger rail. I mean, there's all kinds of new technology that's being discussed. I mean, new magnetic levitation systems are coming out in different parts of the world, like Japan. The Hyperloop has been something that has, I don't know if you've heard of this, but Elon Musk has, proposed, and it could take place in the next couple decades. So there's going to be a lot of future for the technology side, and it's exciting to see what our students will be able to do. Not to mention, now the government is starting to fund railway projects and research much more than they ever have. I mean, the infrastructure bill that was passed in, I guess it was 2021, that's billions of dollars that are going into the railroad industry that haven't had that kind of momentum and kind of injection of funding into the industry for quite a while. So now's a great time for anyone that's thinking about studying railway engineering. If there's a high school student out there, this is the time to pursue a major like this, because there's tons of opportunities, great salaries, and a lot of bright future and exciting things that you can be a part of.